Now, today I'm going to talk about something pretty different from what you're probably expecting from a normal key aircraft series, but if you've seen the title, you might have an idea. I'm talking about the development of fighter control, and I'm talking about it in relation to aircraft development, because that's part of it. Often when we're talking about systems, and this is one of the reasons why alternate histories are quite interesting to go down, but this is not an alternate history. Please note that. This is not. Is that the good alternate histories to go down are the systems which were undeveloped but didn't come into service for some particular reason. Because navies and armed forces in general tend to have quite advanced plans for what they want those systems to do. So we can kind of predict if they work, this is what they will do with them, and therefore you can sort of plug it into the system and you can see what might have happened and what would have been the case. I've called this the Seafire Doctrine Saga. Because for quite a while, the Royal Navy has this idea of what they want a fast intercept fighter to be like. Now, please note they have two fighters in their doctrine strategy. They have a reconnaissance strike escort fighter, which is realistically what the Fulmar is being procured for. That's realistically what the Fulmar is being procured for. Although the crews will not receive enough training necessarily in reconnaissance during wartime, etc., and various other things. So we'll get into that. And an interceptor fighter. Interceptor. Now that's the important thing to think about. Interceptor fighter. What's it supposed to do? Intercept strikes. It's fairly obvious, Alex. Surely. Interceptor fighter. Very simple. It is there to intercept strikes. It is there to take out the enemy aircraft. Yeah. But its use, how you would use it, how you would operate it, compared to the fighters and the fighter control as we understand them in World War II, as applied by the fleet, is very different. Because interceptor and the air defense doctrine that comes to mind is far closer to the ideas of what was used in the Battle of Britain, whereby fighters were on crash alert and were launching to intercept the German bomber raids coming in. Now, that made sense, and makes sense for the land-based aircraft at the time, but they have aircraft designed around that. That's where the Spitfire comes from. And it starts off with Specification F.7. Now, F.7 is a lovely specification. This is one of the aircraft put to it. The Gull-Wing Spitfire, as we often call it. Well, the originator of the Gull-Wing Spitfire work. The Type 224 Supermarine aircraft. And, by the way, the Supermarine themselves request the name Seafire be allocated to them at some point in 1937. It's granted in 1938. And that's a whole interesting different saga we won't be getting into. I've done discussions of that in the past, but today we're talking about this. And the whole point about this aircraft and the whole focus of it was that it could climb rapidly. It was going to use a reliable engine. It's going to be very reasonably fast, but it could climb rapidly. And when I say climbing rapidly, I am talking about the fact that it can is supposed to require to reach a steep rate of climb for night interception, specifically. But this aircraft, as we'll be talking later, has a speed to get to 15,000 feet in 9.5 minutes. Now, the thing is, according to the best advisors at the time that the Royal Navy was getting on the air threat at sea, it was going to be facing high-level bombers who were going to be doing bombing runs at sea. And if you think about it, that's what the Americans are planning to do with the B-17s. That's what the Reggio Marina, Reggio Aeronautica were planning to do with some of their aircraft. So that's not exactly a bad threat assessment. We might know now, and honestly you probably could have worked out then, that that's not really a good method of attacking high-level bombing runs over ships because they can maneuver. Despite what might have happened in certain tests in America when the ship was moored and not going anywhere and had all sorts of cumulative damage building up. We'll leave that to one side. when ships are maneuvering at sea, high-level bombing really, the ship has to make mistakes and you have to be very lucky. But yeah, so this has got radar decline and night intercept. And the thing about it is, when you start looking through this, is critical thing the whole way from 1930 onwards, the British are asking for their aircraft, and even before that, for them to have the facilities on board to allow them to have night intercept, including two-way radio. All sort of things are being included in this. Now, when we start talking about this program and F-730 and how it leads to eventually the Hawker Hurricane and the Spitfire, by various means, and various programs post World War II, even through the war, this is the genesis point of quite a lot of the fighter programs and quite a lot of the fighter development that will dominate the British effort during World War II and post World War II. I talked about the Sea Fury in the last episode of Key Aircraft. Well, they are focusing here on the Goshawk, which is another development of the Kestrel, and the Goshawk will be further refined with more knowledge from the Kestrel eventually into the Merlin, but the Goshawk doesn't do well. Still, the Type 224 comes out with quite good capabilities. And the point the Royal Navy's thinking at this point for its air intercept is the reason it has the two fighters, is it's thinking these fighters will be on a deck alert. Yes, I know, the Royal Navy famously doesn't like deck parking. It doesn't like deck parking for accounting for aircraft numbers and storage, but for alert status for operational reasons, it's quite happy to have deck parking. It doesn't want to include deck parking in its number counting of aircraft because then you need that spaces for storing aircraft. You can't use that space for we need to bunk some alert aircraft into it. And the whole point of deck parking the aircraft was they would rapidly launch. Fighters would get into them, they'd launch, and they'd zoom up and intercept the enemy strike aircraft coming in. That's the point of the deck park. And that's the idea. That is the idea. And the Goshawk and the Supermarine Type 224 are part of this. Part of this program and part of this development. And one interesting thing about the Type 224 with its gull wings is that it's not a good design for the land-based portion of the air development. But the thing is, the aircraft is tested in quite extensively through 1931, 1932 once, a bit in 1931, 1933 and 1934. It's looked at by a lot of people. One of those people is the third Sea Lord, who was appointed in 1933, a guy called Admiral Henderson, who's the former Rear Admiral aircraft carriers, and who is the guy who's principally wrestling with the problem of air defence of the fleet, and how to design the fleet around it, and how to build the fleet so that it can work in a non-permissive air environment, is to use modern phraseology, i.e. under air attack. How is the fleet going to keep going? And this is a problem he's wrestling with. And he's got to design two sides of the coin. Because if you're designing your carriers with no relation to the aircraft that you're going to put on, either the first generation or the second generation, you'll end up with poorly designed carriers. But broadly speaking, what you're designing as a carrier for a carrier is the largest box you can possibly put aboard a ship to take the most aircraft. There's a reason why when me and Drakenfell were doing the Two Historians episode talking about aircraft carrier development and the potentials of aircraft carrier development, we talked about the fact that realistically you could potentially fit more F-35C on a Queen Elizabeth class hangar than you could F-35B because of the different space requirements for their sizing. I don't think in actual fact it would work out that way, as we discussed. We decided that ultimately it probably wouldn't. But there's a theory because of the way you could maybe maneuver the parking around and maybe get one or two extra in. But as a practical operational requirement, probably not. But the thing is, the interceptor fighters were going to be single-seat fighters. They were going to be smaller. And that has a bearing, because they're going to be smaller and take up less space than the reconnaissance fighters. So if you talk about bigger two-seater reconnaissance aircraft, well, and they take up more space, that's going to reduce the space you have for aircraft. And in this period, that's far more dramatic. especially with the folding wings that the Supermarine keep looking at. Before I go too far with this picture, I should probably point out it's an American task group from later in World War II. But the point is, as we're talking about this, I'm going to talk about the Mark I eyeball and how it's able to spot things. Well, it's very rare task groups come together this closely. They are bunched up together because they're going into Ulithi for maintenance. They are going in for replenishment and restocking. So they've all come together into a line to sail into a space. Usually task groups are far more spread out than this, which makes the Mark I eyeball more viable than we might necessarily presume, because we're probably presuming when we're talking about it that it's literally just the carrier and looking out. No, it's other ships, and they are spread out over a wider area. One of the things you often get with movies that historians try not to moan too much about, because we understand it's for the cinematography reasons, is that the task groups are condensed far closer together than they would actually be. They would be far further apart. They'd be spread out far more for the operating room and space for the ships to work. They're not as bunched up as they often are in movies. Now, the problem you might be thinking with this is, Alex, how are they going to detect the enemy coming in? Well, in exercises, the usual option was to use destroyers and airborne aircraft, with both of them armed with binoculars, looking out, spotting for enemy aircraft coming in, and the moment they see them, radioing the carrier, fighters launch. That's how they're doing it. Now, it's not a particularly brilliant system, as you can imagine, but it's also not a bad system. For its period, it's state-of-the-art. And having those aircraft ready to launch to do that intercept matters. Now, occasionally they try flying a CAP, a combat air patrol, over the group, but the trouble is the fighters don't always have enough fuel, especially short range ones, to make it economical to keep them up in the air for that time. Plus, the amount of maintenance those aircraft need, it cumulatively builds up. And you have to remember again, the Royal Navy's a 24-hour air service. So whilst in wartime, they find when they're facing a lot of other nations, they don't need to worry about air defense at night, so they can save up maintenance and do maintenance in the evening. They can do all sorts of crew rest in the evenings. They can do everything else in the evenings. In their exercises pre-war, especially in the 1930s, they don't give themselves that luxury. They don't give themselves that freedom, that benefit. In their training, and this is one of the reasons why I say the different air services, all of them are almost at their peak of training capability of individual pilots in terms of what they want to do with them in about before they go to war. Because they've trained that generation of pilots completely, and then they're going to depend on that generation of pilots to pass on their training as best they can during wartime to other pilots to keep that force going. And this is again why the Royal Navy and the US Navy, with their how do I put this, conscious withdrawal of pilots back to the training squadrons and then sending them forward as part of new squadrons and splitting squadrons and all those things, to consciously make an effort to pass on that institutional memory, manage to hold up that capability, those skill sets, those pre-war standards, far better than the IJN do. Now, the thing is, this doesn't really work. And you can understand why at this point, in this period, the Royal Navy really starts looking, I would argue, more towards the larger two-seater fighters. A, they're felt to have better situational awareness because they have a second pair of eyeballs. And second person to do some spotting, reconnaissance duty. And also, you're putting in more fuel, so you can actually keep them up longer, and you can actually carry out a combat air patrol. And the whole idea is, well, how do we use these aircraft then to maximize them? And you sort of see some of the developments going into a zoom and boom capability. Now, please note, the Royal Navy doesn't lose track of the interceptor. The Gloucester Sea Gladiator is a great example of an aircraft procured for that role. But the thing is, the Royal Navy's still looking at a better thing coming up, and a better idea coming up. And then they find radar. And the Royal Navy adopts radar rather quickly. I mean, Henderson's third Sea Lord in 1933. He learns about development of radar. He spends years nagging. Him and his team do. And please note, it's a team effort. Some people sometimes go, well, this captain was leading nagging. Yes, but that captain's on Henderson's staff, and Henderson's providing top cover and nagging people further up the food chain. Quite loudly and quite longly. That's how it works. And the first vessel they go to sea is HMS Saltburn, October 1936, with radar. A Type 79, original version, OG version of Type 79. And it's a good system. It's not a great system, but for 1936, it's blooming brilliant. And they suddenly go, well, hang on. This gives us a bit more range, and this gives us a bit more capability, and a bit more capability at night and in daytime, in cloudy and bad weather. And, oh, maybe the interceptor aircraft can work again. Because we've been sort of oscillating between maybe they can't and maybe they can. And this is the pace of technological change during this period. This is why I find it funny when people go, this is going to immediately work. Well, it might work now, but might it still work in 4 years' time when something else comes along? You never know. There's going to be a cyclical change in development of stuff, and how it works could be very different than how you envisage it working. Now, the Royal Navy spends about 18 months or so testing around, playing around with the Saltburn and going for exercises and seeing how it works, and testing as best they can. And then they're fitting it onto Sheffield, and then they're fitting it onto Rodney. So they fit it onto a town-class cruiser. They then fit it onto a battleship, and they even fit Curlew, a C-class, with the next generation of the Type 79 in September 1939. This is a really interesting thing to think about. The Royal Navy has had the original, the modified, and the Generation 1.0. So you've got Generation 0, Generation 0.5, broadly speaking, and Generation 1 of a radar set going out by 1939. Now, yes, they haven't started mass production yet. They're ordering them. They're ordering sets. They're planning for mass production. But there is a reason why Henderson has put and has developed destroyers and all these things with the capability to take these radars from about 1935 onwards. Every single destroyer design that's gone through, every sloop design, every cruiser design, every single design and ship that's been built from 1935 onwards has been designed with the idea in mind that it's going to have radar fitted later. Every single one. Now, you might go, well, hang on, do they have cubbies for the radar operators and all things? Not necessarily. They will have spaces worked out, though, and that's one of the reasons why it's so quickly to find these spaces fitted into ships in question. But the thing that usually we're talking about is they're coming into service with excess electrical power and the ability to have more electrical power easily installed. One of the reasons why it's very easy for Royal Navy destroyers during the war to have diesel or petrol generators added into their systems quite so quickly and easily as they found out they need more is because there were spaces and what designs already worked out for the allocation of more and the weights worked out for the allocation of more before they were even built. It makes things a lot quicker. And now you have radar. Well, great, that makes the interceptor work, doesn't it? And that's where you start to have a lot of discussions going on of what's going to come into service. And that's when you start to have all sorts of people talking about what the Royal Navy can and can't have. And this is the first time there starts being a fight with the Air Ministry. And the Royal Navy eventually goes away and orders the Fulmar, but they still want a Seafire. They still want an interceptor fighter. And one of the problems the Royal Navy has in this is that even some of their own supposed allies, their own supposed friends in this matter, are causing them problems, are causing them issues. A good example is during the war, in its initial postings, the First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill, is one of the key people who turns down makes the Royal Navy and argues against the Royal Navy getting an order of 50 Seafires, which were folding wing early generation Spitfires, in 1940. They're placing the order. He's one of the key people who argues against it. Spitfires are needed for the RAF and supporting the army in Europe, not needed for the Navy. Now, honestly, that is par for the course with Churchill, because in World War I he'd sacrificed the Royal Navy strategy on the altar of the army, and in this period he does that. But honestly, Churchill is one of those things of, he is both a useful addition and a key and arguer for the Navy and a key advocate for sea power, and one of those people who's also firmly misunderstands things until he's knocked over the head with the realities of how sea power has changed. Because as we talked about before on this channel many times, he comes into being First Lord of the Admiralty and he starts making decisions like he's refighting World War One. And he's righting all the wrongs he did in World War One, and he hasn't realised he's in World War Two. And there's all sorts of his decision on pausing carrying capital ship construction to favour escort construction when the escort construction's already been ordered, and the reason he makes such a song and dance in some of his books about the escorts being emergency programs when you actually go and look at them, they were all ordered in 1938-39, well before one war began. And they'd all been developed and they're all under production, and literally none of the things you say are crash build actually come into service anytime soon. It's all the stuff they've ordered in huge bulk numbers prior to the war. But yeah, politicians are politicians. Now the Fairey Fulmar caused an adjustment again. And this is where we get a difference in cradle of aviations, because you see, Glorious down here has been the cradle of naval aviation for the Royal Navy for about the previous decade in the Mediterranean. And they've been operating with her and destroyers, and they've been using fast flying fighters, single-seat fighters, flying off her to intercept strikes coming in. And she could carry enough. She could also maintain some sort of cap if she wanted as well, and sometimes would even have, both types of fighter on there, reconnaissance fighter as sort of aircraft, the reconnaissance aircraft, and the interceptors. Well, Illustrious is designed, I would argue, the Illustrious class, and when you read through the papers about them, they are designed around the idea of the interceptors. They are what the Royal Navy is expecting to have a single-seat interceptor in service, and the Illustrious class, which are not the largest hangars the Royal Navy could build, but are the best protected hangars they could build for fleet operations in the scenarios where they expect to be tough fleet battles, whether that's in the South China Sea approaching Japan or in the Mediterranean, or any of those scenarios, or any of the scenarios where they think they're going to be operating with the fleet as a long way away from British infrastructure. So they need an aircraft carrier which is going to be rugged and able to survive, because if anything goes wrong and needs to be repaired, it's going to have a long way to go home and be repaired. Well, they designed that more around having a smaller fighter. They designed that round more about having a smaller, more protective aircraft. I know I keep crossing my arms. Please note it's not me being defensive or anything. It's literally, I don't know what to do with them. If I have them doing this the whole time, people sometimes think it's weird. So I'm just trying to position them. And people think the whole scenario of this carrier is round fleet defense, where the interceptor fighters are more useful. The strike fighters are more useful for your larger carriers, your strike carriers, which Glorious and Cradles have filled the role developing, and Ark Royal and the Implacables were basically the continuations of that idea. If you need to have a large enough carrier to do the strike duties and hold back. And basically the Royal Navy had divided up the carrier role. Again, I've discussed this before on this channel and other videos on aircraft carriers, because of the realities of getting what they wanted underneath the Washington and London treaties. Now, the thing is, though, the Illustrious finds itself operating Fulmars. Not the Interceptors, Fulmars. And it's got radar. And they quickly go back to their exercise and go, now what did we do? What did we use to operate? How have we done this in the past in exercises? Well, we've done a combat air patrol. Let's do that. We've got radar. We can direct the air. Now we have to learn how to direct the aircraft in. Not to be able to give them details, point them in direction, send them off. We have to give them coordination up in the air. We have done this to an extent before the war. We have done this in exercises. We have some ideas of how to do this. So let's test it out. And let's do it. Now, people sometimes refer to Eagle as the starting point, but Eagle, remember, has Sea Gladiators. They are still very much running an intercept policy. And they don't have a lot of them, but they have enough. It's amazing. The Royal Navy always finding boxed aircraft where they need it around the Empire. It's almost as if they stashed it there prior to the war and then forgot about it. We'll see. But the Illustrious class, they keep pushing us. They keep pushing this airborne this sort of airborne combat air patrol sitting forward. And that changes the intercept pattern, and it changes the intercept problems. And this is where we get air defense doctrines develops. Because realistically, using J.R. Hill's works here, realistically, the Royal Navy had been thinking, if you look at the top right-hand diagram, the Royal Navy had been thinking of fighter aircraft, broadly speaking, and this is a interesting thing as it comes from page 53 of J.R. Hill's book, as almost point defense and area defense missile systems. They are supposed to go up from the carriers and intercept. But you're changing that to a fighter cap which is a longer range away. And as you can see from that, the diagram on the left shows that this is the problem when you're dealing with it. You've got, in this case, it's a missile intercept because it's a book staged in the Cold War, but even an aircraft intercept. If you've got the aircraft coming in, you've got your cap flying, you have radar coming from your carrier, you need to vector in those aircraft onto an intercept course. Where can they intercept? I need to work that out. I need to work out an intercept angle for them to have an advantage. Because remember, again, the problem is a Fulmar is a zoom and boom fighter. It's a reconnaissance aircraft. It's procured under 0838. F stands for fighter. B, bomber. O, observation aircraft. It's a zoom and boom fighter, though. So you need to vector it in. You need to have the cap up as high as it can do, and you're prepared to zoom it down and have it attack. And then you need to make sure as you're vectoring in the cap, you're launching your alert aircraft, and you're readying your aircraft from below the deck to come up. Well, hang on, do you do that? You have to make a decision of, do you think the enemy strike's going to get through? Is it going to be like this scenario? Or what do you do? Because once those fighters have done one zoom and boom, they then have to regain altitude before they can zoom in and attack again. They don't want to be dogfighting. And that's the difference between the intercept aircraft and why the Royal Navy continues pushing for the intercept aircraft. They were supposed to be the dogfighter. They were supposed to be the aircraft which would mix it up. Basically, they were supposed to go up and go into the enemy aircraft and then start fighting away with them in the middle of the aircraft and cause them all sorts of trouble in the aircraft and have the speed and maneuverability to do that. But they were shorter range. The cap aircraft are endurance aircraft. They can stay up for longer. And this is the interesting thing, because eventually, of course, the Royal Navy does get the Seafire. The Royal Navy does get the Seafire. They get the aircraft, the high-performance interceptor they've been asking for so long. And by that point, their combat air patrol has moved on. Their air defense at sea has moved on. And they start using Seafires more as strike aircraft and more as attacking aircraft and as systems than they use them as air defense systems. Yes, they are used as fighters. Please don't get me wrong, they're not used as fighters. But they're not the backbone of the fighter strength in the Pacific when they come out there. They're not the backbone for the Royal Navy as its operations. The aircraft is the backbone, and this is where it's really interesting when we consider the Type 224, is the Gullwing Corsair. Because that has both the speed and power to do the alert fighters and do the interception and do the operations, but also has the endurance to do the air patrol. So basically what we have is a system which starts off, and it's appropriate to leave it here, but I think I'll take it back to the Seafire because this is the good point to talk on. We have a system which starts off there looking for how to do air defense at sea, and their idea is based on interception. It's based on point defense and area defense, using aircraft basically as a substitute for missiles and in the modern system. And that makes sense in the period we're talking about, in the 1920s and 30s, where your aircraft might not have the endurance. You are still getting the radios up to the point of reliability that they're going to achieve, but you're working on it. That's why you've been specifying radios for so long. And you have the limitations of the technology at the time. And it looks like a good plan. And let's be honest, it is basically a scaled version of what they used in the Battle of Britain, whereby they have radars, but originally they were setting up observer posts to spot enemy strikes coming in, radio back, and call for the fighters to be launched from the airfields to go and intercept them. They just replace the observers. Well, actually, they supplement the observers with the radars, and then the observers start supplementing the radars as the technology refines itself. And that works. It really does work for the land bases in this period, and does quite well. And then they eventually do start having a air patrol sort of scenario going on, but that causes other complications in terms of misidentification by different systems of what they are, and you occasionally get almost intercepts of two British forces trying to intercept each other. It was an interesting time, but the thing is, the Navy's forced to go a different route because they don't get the interceptor aircraft. They don't get the interceptor. They are forced to develop a combat air patrol system which is based on the testing and exercise they've done, but it wasn't realistically for the fleet carrier. It was for the strike carrier that was going to have fighters like that. It was for the larger carriers, which were going to have the larger fighters, the larger air group carriers, which are going to have the larger fighters to escort their strikes, and that they were going to be able to launch a combat air patrol. That's how they could maintain their air defense. And the other thing that was advantageous was because then those fighters could rapidly go forward to back up the fleet carrier. Because remember again, the Royal Navy's whole fleet doctrine would be you would have reconnaissance carriers, scout carriers, the cruiser carriers as they were later on called, out with the cruisers helping out the reconnaissance, finding the enemy. You have the fleet carriers with the fleet providing constant strike and constant air defense over fleet operations. So if there's a battle going on, they're closer to provide that. Sitting back, you have the strike carriers. And the strike carriers are there to muller the enemy if they hide in harbour. They are going to provide the overwhelming firepower that will hit that harbour. But also, they're the on-call strike that the Admiral can call for to go hit that and take out that enemy. And they will come from a different angle. So you'll be engaging you as the enemy will be engaging the fleet, going, they have their carriers, their battleships, everything's there. I'm Corsair, I'm going to bash that, and focusing on that. And then suddenly, out from the other side, whoom! What the frick just hit me? That's the strike carriers. That's the British plan. Okay, they don't ever manage to really achieve that plan because they never... Despite years of exercises of doing multi-carrier operations and exercises in multi-carrier training, the whole reason they generate for the rear admiral aircraft carriers is literally they're doing multi-carrier operations. They rarely in World War II, up until the end, ever get to do multi-carrier operations, and by the time they are doing multi-carrier operations, there isn't really a fleet for them to engage in a battle. Unless they wanted to pick a fight with the Americans, in which case they were both using the same kit. It'd be quite interesting. It'd be a very interesting and quite a sad fight in some regards. But neither of them fancied doing that, because both were quite respectful of each other, and they were allies. So yeah, not really an option. Just to sort of prove how good they were at doing it. Having a fight with each other just to prove how good they were at attacking fleets at sea by the end of the war would just really have been pointless. It really would have been. But the point is, realistically, at the time when this was being asked for, when the Gullwing Spitfire was Seafire was being asked for, and when the modified Spitfire was being asked for, and when eventually the Seafire was got, the Royal Navy was, prior to this, looking for an interceptor. When it finally gets the Seafire, and to an extent, lots of people turn around to him and go, "You finally got it, aren't you happy?" And Navy's going, "We don't really want it now, but we need aircraft. So we're going to keep using it, and we're going to use it." But the thing is, by the time it's got, because it wasn't available earlier in the war, the doctrine's changed so much that it no longer fits neatly into that doctrine. It doesn't. Experience of war. And the experience can be forced not just by enemy action, but what you have available to use. You develop a doctrine based on what you have in service, what you have available. You develop a procurement plan and a doctrine in terms of peacetime on what you want to have available and what you want and what you think you're going to have available. But the moment wartime happens, you start having to modify that doctrine to what you have. And you push from there onwards. And that's what the Royal Navy do. And that's where the Combat Air Patrol really sort of finds its place in the Mediterranean and in the Royal Navy fleet operations in the North Sea, and how they operate. And this is how they operate in the Indian Ocean, and how HMS Victorious operates when she's playing at being a American USS Robin, and all these things. That all comes from the fact that the Royal Navy didn't have the aircraft it wanted. And here's the interesting thing for you to think about. I would actually argue that the Combat Air Patrol, and as a system, makes a lot more sense for a Navy. It really does, to operate, however, and operate its air defense from, than an interceptor. Especially when you look at it in hindsight. And I would also argue that therefore, if the Royal Navy had got the Seagull, the Gullwing Seafire, sorry. In my head, I tend to nickname it the Seagull, even though that's a completely different Supermarine flying boat. If they had got it, whilst it would certainly have been effective, they would have been slower to change their doctrine to the more suitable doctrine because of its effectiveness, and therefore might have ended up building up more risk for later in the war. They would have avoided possibly some of the earlier war issues and losses and damage because of having a far better fighter in service. But later war, in the mid-war, when the preponderance of enemy aircraft, especially in the Mediterranean, builds up, etc., I would argue that such a system would get overwhelmed far more quickly if you're relying on launching your fighters to intercept than a combat air patrol. And if you'd had these aircraft in service, that would have been that would have led to that carrying on. Now, it might not have. And there is certainly a good argument, especially in the Mediterranean, with the number of aircraft you have available, to also maintain a combat air patrol, as that's a far better utilization of assets. But I'm not sure how quickly they get there. I'm not sure how quickly. I also think you'd probably have a scenario whereby you could have a lot more of the Seafires, the Gullwing Seafires, on an illustrious class than you would have Fulmars, if they were available again. But I want to hear your views and whether you think that it could have actually been a bit of a poison chalice, or whether it would have been just all better. All better. And what else other videos have we got coming up? We have got coming up... Oh, it's the of 2 submarines. It's the whole list of all the vessels sunk and how they were sunk in over the 10-day period of November and through history by submarines. Just to give you a bit of a sampling point of that. It's an interesting piece of history. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care.